You shall multiply my wonders in the land, and in this shall they know that I am the Lord.
Well, folks, I want you to know I spent about maybe 30 years of research into several of the topics we'll be talking about. However, there are a number of very, very highly qualified and well-educated people on these various subjects that we're going to use some of their information in this film as well. And at the end of the DVD, we will show their names and give them great credit for what they did. I decided to include the story of Christopher Columbus in America's anniversary because this year, 2020, was a spring and summer where protesters in several American cities have defaced, spray painted, decapitated, or destroyed statues of Columbus. Even though Columbus lived about 500 years ago, his contributions discovering the New World are very important to America's history. I believe you will be amazed about Columbus's story. It's a story most of you do not know. You will see parallels to Israel's history, and at the end of the day, you will see God's mighty hand in much of it. To start, we know Christopher Columbus was born in the year 1451, exactly 500 years before me. There's great debate as to where he was born, although some say it was in Genoa, Italy. I wanted the viewers to know there's a lot of great talking points most of you have never heard before in the DVD that we're presenting to you. Much of this presentation about Columbus was researched by a number of other men who spent many years of study to make this possible. We have to give major credit to Charles Garcia. His findings were published by CNN in May of 2012. He claimed Columbus was actually a Jew. Aside from Mr. Garcia, Jose Arrigo, Kelso Garcia de la Rega, Otero Sanchez, Nicholas Diaz Perez, and Dr. Perry Stone have all concluded in their research that Christopher Columbus was a Marrano Jew. You might be interested to know Columbus didn't speak Italian, and his name in Spain was Cristobal Colon. Most or much of what you learned about Columbus in school does not give a clear perspective about the day and age that he lived in. So let's go back to the year 1492. Most of us learned Columbus set sail with the expectation of finding a direct water route west of Europe to Asia with the purpose of enriching Spanish monarchs with golden spices from the Orient. Was that the real purpose? Well, actually, it wasn't. You need to keep in mind that Columbus was living during the Spanish Inquisition. There was horrendous persecution taking place against the Jews in Spain. Now, let me say Columbus and his family, they had to live their faith undercover. He knew at some point all the Jews who did not convert to Catholicism would have all of their possessions, money, and land confiscated. Jews who were forced to renounce Judaism to Catholicism were known as conversos or converts. Columbus' real motivation for sailing away from Spain was to find a safe haven for Jews. In fact, his real passion was to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims. And the money he could possibly get from finding a trade route to the Orient could possibly make that happen. We know Columbus would set sail August 3rd, 1492. But about 4 months earlier, in March, on March 31st, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella created an edict that stated that all the Jews had to be expelled from Spain on a particular set date. At that time, the spring of 1492, there were about 800,000 Jews who hadn't converted. That gave them about 4 months to decide. I wanted the viewers to know tens of thousands of Marranos were tortured during the Inquisition. Jews were finally given a set date: either leave the country or convert or die after the 2nd of August, 1492. Many that didn't convert and stayed were actually burned at the stake. Now, I will say earlier that year, Columbus was preparing his three ships to be built. The Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, which of course is the ship that Columbus would captain. He was desperate for money to finance this project. Believe it or not, his efforts were not financed by Queen Isabella and Ferdinand, the king. The money to build the ships came from 2 Jewish conversos, along with one other prominent Jewish man. Louis de Santiago and Gabriel Sanchez gave an interest-free loan of 17,000 ducats of their own money, as did Don Isaac Abrabanel, a rabbi and Jewish statesman. You might be interested to know the first 2 letters that Columbus sent back after his successful voyage did not go to the king and queen, but to Senegal and Sanchez, thanking them for their support, and he related his findings about his journey. Well, back to the 3 ships. It took time to build them, and it was getting down to crunch time to be out of Spain. Originally, they chose the 2nd of August to sail, then realized the 2nd of August was Tish B'Av, or the 9th of Av on the Jewish calendar. That Jewish calendar day had a bad reputation in Israel's past history. Not only was the first and second temple in Israel destroyed on that date, but Jews had to convert, leave, or die on that day as well in Spain during Columbus's time. That ominous day continued on in future history, for Jews were expelled from England on the 9th of Av in the year 1290 AD. World War I actually began on the 9th of Av. And under Hitler's final solution, the first trainload of Jews at Treblinka were gassed to death on July 23rd, 1942, also on the 9th of Av. It was not an easy decision for Columbus as to when to sail, but for sure he was not going to sail on the 9th of Av. The decision was they would sail the following day on the 3rd of August, 1492. For the record, in Simon Wiesenthal's book, Sails of Hope, he mentioned Columbus was motivated to find a safe haven for the Jews. And Carol Delaney, an anthropologist at Stanford, concluded Columbus was a deeply religious man whose purpose was to sail to Asia to obtain gold in order to finance some kind of crusade to take back Jerusalem and rebuild a holy temple. Aside from the 6 names that I provided to you at the beginning of this story, who believes there's strong evidence that Columbus was a secret Jew, I might also point to his official signature. Columbus used a triangular signature of dots and letters that paralleled inscriptions found on gravestones in Spain. He made it clear before his death that signature would be carried forth by his heirs. Only Jews had that kind of signature, by the way. As to Columbus's language, a linguistics professor at Georgetown University analyzed the language and syntax of hundreds of handwritten letters, diaries, and documents written by Columbus, and concluded his primary written and spoken language was actually Castilian Spanish. Before we conclude our story, it's only fitting to share one last significant historical fact about Columbus. When you go back to Israel's ancient history, you see some terrible things that happened to Israel and things that they went through, but later there was actually a time of victory. Case in point, the destruction of the first temple. And Israel went into slavery to Babylon for 70 years. The Babylonians raided all the gold and wealth that the Jews had. The Persians later conquered, as you know, the Babylonians. And once 70 years had passed, the Persians allowed Israel to go back home. They not only financed Israel to go back home, but funded the rebuilding of the temple and the rebuilding of the wall around Jerusalem. So victory came in the 70th year. Wanted you to know that. By the way, they got all the gold and all the treasure vessels the Babylonians stole 70 years earlier when they left to go back to Israel. Can you see God in all this? I don't know about you, but I can. As I mentioned earlier, Columbus began his voyage the day after the 9th of Av, which obviously was the 10th of Av. That was the 3rd of August, 1492. Columbus noted his departure coincided with the burning of the first and second temple, the 10th of Av, in Jewish history. There's no doubt Columbus planned his voyage and departure very carefully. The captains of the Nina and Pinta were Martin Vincente and Francisco Pinzon. We know a number of crew members were actually Jewish as well. The most well-known was Luis de Torres. As the journey across the ocean went on, many crew members wanted to turn back about 2 or 3 days before land would actually be sighted. The Pinzon brothers met with Columbus, concerned that a mutiny would take place. It was decided if land was not sighted within 3 days, they would turn around. That date on the Hebrew calendar was the 18th of Tishri in the Hebrew year 5253. That meeting took place in the middle of the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot. It coincides with Israel's wandering in the wilderness. According to Dr. Perry Stone in his book, Plucking the Eagle's Wings, on pages 54 and 55, around 2 a.m. on Friday, October 12th, which was a Sabbath day, I might add, as the 3 days were nearly over, Rodrigo de Triana, who may be Jewish, sighted land. It was recorded in the book Columbus's Jewish Roots that when land was sighted, another Jew responded by saying Vana in Hebrew, meaning where. And Triana replied, Hana, meaning there. This day began the 70th day of the voyage. So 70 days was just completed. 70 in the Bible, by the way, prophetically represents restoration. So on the 71st day, Columbus stepped ashore and knelt in the sand and he prayed. After praying, he christened the island as San Salvador, meaning Holy Savior. So land was sighted on the 70th day. It coincided with the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, the 7th day. But it was the next day that Columbus actually stepped ashore. Even though the Feast of Tabernacles is a 7-day feast, an 8th day was attached to it, even in ancient times, as well as observed by Jews all over the world today. It's called Shemini Atzeret, or Simchat Torah. It means the rejoicing in the Torah. So the same 8th day of Tabernacles that Solomon dedicates the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 66, and releases the people from that dedication, is the same 8th day of Tabernacles Columbus dedicates San Salvador into the New World. The timing of this entire piece of history is absolutely astounding. I'd be willing to say all those protesters who defaced or destroyed those statues of Columbus. If they knew their history, they would be very ashamed. Hopefully, this great story gives you a better appreciation of your country and the sacrifices people made to benefit others and your future. In this segment of America's Anniversary, we'll go back to the year 1607. I want you to know there's a real love story in this piece of history. It's about Jamestown, Virginia, that we'll be talking about. This is the place where this happens. It was the beginning of the white man's colonization here in America. It's important to point out there are many parallels to Israel's past within the context of this story, and I believe you'll see the hand of God at work here. Our story begins with King James I authorizing the Virginia Company to sail to America to establish a fort on the East Coast. Now, this endeavor was purely about economics, to be true. They knew there was a natural deepwater port there in that area from prior experience in the Chesapeake Bay, and this would be actually a great place to start. There were 3 ships that departed England: the Constant Susan, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. The 3 ships reached what's now Cape Henry at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. They stepped upon the shore on the 14th of May, 1607. Did you notice that's the same calendar day Israel became a nation in 1948 on May 14th? The first thing they did was pray on the shore. They not only erected a cross in the sand, but declared this land for Jesus Christ, and they had the authority of the king to do that. It's believed there were about 104 colonists that got off those 3 ships. The next order of business was to build a triangular-looking fort protected with cannons. During this time, I wanted the folks to know there was actually a sign in the heavens during their voyage and while they were building their colony. It was Halley's Comet. You can go online and see it was there in 1607. Even though it was spring, it was during one of the worst droughts in about 500 years, so water was not easy to come by, and there were lots of mosquitoes. We thought it was important to point out the first settlement was named Jamestown after, again, King James I. You may not be aware that the name James in Hebrew is Yaakov, which means Jacob. From a Hebrew's perspective, it's actually Jacobstown. We're all familiar with Captain John Smith, and by the way, no relation to me. There's no question he had a very colorful personality with many events associated with this first settlement. Years later, he actually wrote a history of Virginia in the year 1626. He referred to King James as Jacobus, identifying a connection with James and Jacob as we see them actually in the context of the Bible. We only have Captain Smith's word for it, but he mentioned the story about being captured by the Powhatan Indian tribe, and the chief's 10 to 11-year-old daughter, Pocahontas, begged for Smith's life as he was about to be executed. Even though there are no other proofs or witnesses, I tend to believe his story. If that story is true, Pocahontas saved Smith's life, and to be fair, for some years, Smith played a very important role in the colonist survival, and at some point would actually play a leadership role there. It was always a touchy relationship between the Indians and the Jamestown people. There were many occasions where the Indians actually assisted with food and the colonists provided tools to the Indians to work with. I would encourage you to go online and read about this great history. Encyclopedia Britannica is also another good source online. Over time, you might ask, was there a love story between John Smith and Pocahontas? We actually don't know about that, but we do have a love story. As time goes by, there was a colonist who was involved in tobacco. His name was John Rolfe. He and Pocahontas fell madly in love, but they wanted to do it right. John approached the city fathers and told them that he and Pocahontas wanted to get married. It was decided if Pocahontas married John Rolfe, she would have to become a Christian and get baptized. It was also suggested that she take on a Christian name. I want to stop right here and let you know there is a very beautiful picture of Pocahontas being baptized in a very long, beautiful white gown. That picture is located in the National Rotunda of our nation's capital. Well, what actually ended up happening? Well, strangely enough, Pocahontas would take on the name Rebecca. So let's think about this. This is the first cross-cultural marriage between the white man and the Indians in the New World. Looking back to ancient Israel, the first real Jewish marriage was with Isaac and Rebekah. After all, Abraham and Sarah were not born Jews, although Abraham would end up being the father of the Jews and the Arabs. Just wanted you to see a parallel with Pocahontas and Rebekah in the Bible. The marriage between John Rolfe and Pocahontas did bring some temporary peace, but it wouldn't last long term with the Indian tribes. That was in 1614 that John married Pocahontas. Who would have ever expected a story like that? But sometime later, the happy couple sailed off to England. Pocahontas is such a hit in England, she has an audience with the Queen of England. And she was very well received too. She was also given the title Virginia's first Christian. Pocahontas was also referred to as a princess. You could say she was America's first princess, and actually she really was. Not long after the meeting the Queen of England, Pocahontas had passed away of respiratory disease. We believe that she was born in the year 1595, and she died in March of 1617. Today she's buried at Gravesend Cemetery outside of St. George's Church in Kent, England. All of the photos of Pocahontas we have, I'm happy to say we actually have one photo of Pocahontas painted by Simon van de Pas in 1616 while they were based there in England. Well, based on that, we have a pretty good idea what Pocahontas really looked like. Another fact you might enjoy, we've known about 20 years, entertainer Wayne Newton of Las Vegas fame claimed to be a relative of Pocahontas. Newton hired forensic expert Henry Lee of O.J. Simpson fame to track down the remains of Pocahontas with the hope of acquiring DNA. But Newton did all that he could to have Pocahontas's remains brought back to the United States, but in the end was unsuccessful. Several experts feel Newton wasn't a direct descendant of Pocahontas, but in fact he was actually a descendant of Pocahontas's tribe. As you could have guessed, 2007 was the 400th anniversary of Jamestown, Virginia. Now, I have some very outstanding news I'd like to share with you. There was a very huge celebration in 2007 at Jamestown with many dignitaries, several of which included the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, as well as President George W. Bush. Many questions remained about whatever happened to the colony that went missing in action hundreds of years ago, and why is it they've never been able to find any remains of the original fort or remains of any of the people. But we do have some great news to share with you. About 13 years before 2007, a major discovery was made by 66-year-old William Kelso, a world-famous archaeologist. In 1994, this discovery would be made. It ended up being what experts said was the greatest find in 50 years of American archaeological history concerning North America. This was a very big deal. On April 4th, 1994, as Kelso jabbed a shovel into Jamestown soil, he found evidence of buildings erected within the original fort. Tens of thousands of artifacts the settlers left behind, including about 100 remains of the settlers themselves. What a rich new life of history this find brought about, just in time for the 400th anniversary of Jamestown. Just as the original colonists came for God and country, they gave thanks to God and asked for his blessings. What a great lesson we can learn from that. It just goes to show more parallels with Israel's past. Well, folks, I hope you really enjoyed that. May the Lord bless you. We're going to talk a little bit about the discovery of Cape Cod. Before we actually get started in our pilgrim story, I wanted to mention a brief history about the discovery of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. About 110 years after Columbus's discovery of San Salvador, Cape Cod was discovered by Bartholomew Gosnold. This was about 18 years before the Mayflower sailed to America. Like many of our stories in this film, there is a connection to dates that correspond to Israel's history. So Gosnold discovered Cape Cod on the 15th of May, 1602. Notice it was on the 15th of May, 1948, the morning Israel pulled up its flag for the first time. In a moment, we'll be back, and be prepared for a pilgrim story like no other. In 1956, I was sitting in a classroom at Renfro School in Adams, Massachusetts. That's where I grew up. And it's the same town where Susan B. Anthony also grew up in. And by the way, as far as women's suffrage and women's right to vote, this is actually the 100th anniversary of that, 1920 to 2020, this year. And she had a lot to do with that. Now, on this one occasion, we were learning about the pilgrims, and they were showing us pictures of the pilgrims, their funny-looking hats and shoes with the large belt buckles on it, and of course their turkey guns in hand. We also learned about the first Thanksgiving, where the colonists and the Indians sat down at a picnic table and had a great meal. Well, as the years went by, it wasn't until my 50s and 60s that I really took more time to study who these pilgrims were and what contributions that they actually made. I knew I had to connect several dots because the Mayflower Compact and the faith and morals the Pilgrims established in colonial Massachusetts would ultimately be the future framework of the United States of America. As I tried to figure all this out, I kept coming back to the Pilgrims in Plymouth. It's only fitting that we go back to England some years before the Mayflower. And by the way, the majority of the Pilgrims were from England, but they were also mainly Puritans as well. Because it was during their time in England that the Bible came about in English, this was during the time of King James I. The Church of England was the established denomination at that time. Prior to the Bible coming out in English, most of the people had no concept of Bible concepts. As the people started to read the Bible, they perceived leadership starting with God and not from the king and the religious institution. In essence, these Bible-believing people wanted to purge the worldly practices of the established church. Sort of sounds a little bit like today. Thus, they became known as the Puritans. This may come as a surprise to many Americans today, but King James I was a tyrant to the Bible-believing Christians. In fact, called them the separatists, making them an enemy of the state. So in the year 1593, he passed a law making the separatists illegal. They could actually be even put in prison or burned at the stake. I want to be very clear, the King James Bible is the true Word of God, but King James has his name on it, and just because of that doesn't exactly make it that he's a nice guy. But after the Edict of 1593, the Puritans were highly discriminated against, and to be a separatist was actually an act of treason. It now got to a point that they believed it was actually time to leave England. So I want to talk about a couple exoduses that were made. There was more than one trip out of England. So I'm going to talk about the first attempted exodus from England to Holland. The Pilgrims, we'll call them the Pilgrims now, they sold all they had, and they hired a sea captain who was going to take them in the middle of the night to a place called Leiden, Holland. Well, the captain showed up in the middle of the night, and as it turned out, he became a turncoat to them, and he turned them into the government. And he made a deal with the government that if he turned them in, of course they would go to prison, he would be able to keep all their stuff. And actually that was the deal that was made. So basically the folks showed up at the ship in the middle of the night, government showed up, and they put him in prison, and the sea captain got all their stuff. That was Exodus attempt number one. Well, sometime later, after they were out of prison, a second Exodus attempt was made. Another sea captain was hired. The women and children were actually waiting upstream to be picked up by a ship in the middle of the night while their husbands had already been on the ship. Well, as it turned out, the ship left a canal, if you will. They got to the area where the women and children were. They were prepositioned there earlier. They had no idea that the government caught them, and all the women and children went to prison. Now, the men decided to continue on their journey in the ship, and during this journey, there was like a Hurricane Katrina that came up. It was a huge storm. Hundreds of ships in that territory were destroyed. But they actually made it to Leiden, Holland, the men only. Well, as time went by, and I did want you to know that these men surviving this horrific trip, this was nothing short of a major miracle. With God's grace, the women and children finally arrived in Leiden about a year later after they were released from prison. They were at the property of William Brewster. A printing press was set up there whereby Bibles, in fact, could be printed in Holland by the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were actually smuggling Bibles in barrels to Scotland and England, which of course was a capital offense. Over time, King James found out where these Bibles were coming from and set out to destroy that activity. The military was sent into Leiden, and the printing shop was destroyed, and a seal was placed on the door that no one could ever live there again. In total, the Pilgrims would actually be in Leiden, they say 10 to 12 years. We believe it was 12 years that they were there in total. A death threat, or keep in mind, they were living under a death threat at all times from the government. What would you do and your families do? It took guts, but they decided to go back. After all that, they decided to go back to England. Not that they were giving up by any means. As the Pilgrims made their way back to England, into the lion's mouth, if you will, you would think they would have given up. But that never even crossed their mind. They all knew we've got to go somewhere where our children can live in freedom with the expectation of taking the gospel to the whole world. They knew about Jamestown, Virginia, and they decided they would make another attempt to leave England for good, and they would go to a different location in the New World. Once established in England, again, they sold everything that they had, but this time they would hire 2 captains with 2 ships and leave secretly at night. Their leader, his name was Pastor John Robinson. The name of the first ship was called the Mayflower, and the second ship was called the Speedwell. Both ships departed, but soon after, the Speedwell sprang a leak that couldn't be fixed. Pastor Robinson was on the Speedwell. Things were so dire that it was decided that the Mayflower would proceed to America by itself, and Pastor Robinson and several others would end up staying behind. The Mayflower was a cargo ship used for transporting wine in Europe. I guess you could say they had new wine on board. There were 102 passengers made up mostly of Puritans and some Church of England folks, and it also had a crew of 30 crew members on board. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the main mast beam broke on the Mayflower. The captain knew they're probably not going to make it. In fact, if it didn't get fixed, the ship would soon sink. As the new leader, William Bradford, heard about this issue, he went before the people on the ship, and they had to do the only thing that they could do, and that was pray. Soon after, William Brewster remembered he had a large printing screw aboard. The large screw was attached to the beam, and the leak was actually fixed. Perhaps another miracle. Keep in mind, this journey was made in the winter. No normal sea captain would make a journey like this in the winter. It was very windy and cold. They actually planned to go to the Hudson River area of New York, but as they approached Newfoundland, they were blown off course and ended up in the area of what is now known as Cape Cod, Massachusetts. That happened on the 9th of November, 1620. By the way, this journey was no 3-hour tour. The cabin where the Pilgrims lived during the 66-day journey was 4.5 feet high. Passengers were often seasick, and you could imagine 102 passengers in the restroom situation. This ship originally came to the shore at Provincetown, Massachusetts. Since this area is a very narrow piece of land, this was only going to be a temporary stop. As William Bradford's wife stepped off the Mayflower, she fell into the water and actually died. She was actually the first woman to die that was on the Mayflower. Many were very weak and sick. They pretty much had to reside on the ship since it was winter and the land was frozen. There was also snow on the ground as well. It was decided that they write the Mayflower Compact document, and it had to be written before they made their journey over to Plymouth on the west side of the Cape. That would happen some weeks later. So the Mayflower Compact was written while on the ship on November 11th, 1620, the same calendar day that World War I ended. Well, after leaving Provincetown, the Mayflower finally docked at Plymouth, the final destination for the Pilgrims. The date they stepped out on Plymouth Rock was December 21st, 1620. Now, some books or pamphlets may say it was on the December 23rd or December 26th, but all 3 days, different days, actually fall on the Feast of Hanukkah on the Jewish calendar in the year 1620. But we believe it was on the 21st of December. By the way, that was the third day of Hanukkah. Strangely enough, General Allenby victoriously entered Jerusalem on the third day of Hanukkah in 1917 as the British took Jerusalem from the Ottoman Turks. I wonder if God had something to do with that. Well, keep in mind the ground is still frozen. There's no food harvest. There's snow and ice all around them. From December till March, it's a period of about 4 months. Of the 102 that came with the Mayflower, 47 had died in the brutal winter, nearly half. While the men were attempting to build some kind of quarters that winter, the women and children went back to the Mayflower and slept there. The women actually slept on top of the children to keep them alive. By April, most of the women were dead, and most of the children were still alive. Remember, the passenger area of the Mayflower was only 4.5 feet high. From December to March, the Mayflower was still docked at Plymouth. The captain kept reminding the Pilgrims they could still go back to England on the ship. By the way, none of the Pilgrims volunteered to go back. That's how much freedom it meant to them. I wonder how much it means to you. In this talking point, we'll be talking a little bit about God's providence and Plymouth, Massachusetts. As early spring 1621 came about after a devastating hard winter, a blockhouse was built on the shore of Plymouth. One day, out of nowhere, an Indian showed up. Strangely enough, he spoke English and his name was Samoset. He was a chief who lived in what is now the state of Maine. He said he learned English from European white fishermen, actually. Then he told the Pilgrims the area they decided to reside on once belonged to a vicious tribe called the Patuxents, and that's why that area was previously cleared and an excellent place to cultivate. He said about 4 years before the Pilgrims came, a mysterious disease swept through that area and killed everyone in that tribe. It's widely believed today that was smallpox that did that. There's a parallel to Israel's history about a similar thing. In Joshua chapter 24, verse 12 through 14, God told Joshua he sent the hornet to drive out the people living in that area and gave the land to Israel that they didn't labor over and provided cities that they did not build. So God provided the Pilgrims with good land, water, and natural resources. The Pilgrims were told the nearest tribe to them now was the Wampanoags, but they were somewhat of a distance away. That Massasoit was in fact the name of their chief, and oh, by the way, that is where the state of Massachusetts actually got its name. As it turned out, history would tell us Massasoit was the only chief along the eastern seaboard who would befriend the white man outside of Samoset. So you can see the hand of God at work here. Around April 1621, about 4 months after the Pilgrims arrived, as the winter snows were now thawing, an Indian out of nowhere walked up to the Pilgrims. And as unbelievable as it sounds, he too spoke English. He would become to be known as Squanto. I wanted the viewers to know Squanto would play one of the most important people the Pilgrims would come to know. His story needs to be told. Unfortunately, most Americans know very little about him. Squanto belonged to the Patuxent tribe, which once upon a time were located where the Pilgrims were in Plymouth. Years earlier, Squanto was captured by an English sea captain named Thomas Hunt and was taken to Malaga, Spain in the year 1614, 6 years before the Mayflower showed up. Squanto was conveniently bought by the friars in Spain and was taught Christianity and in fact was well treated. His dream was to go to England and eventually get on a ship and go back to Massachusetts. If anyone other than the friars bought him on the auction block, he most likely never would have left Spain. With the help of the Spanish friars, Squanto escaped and traveled to England. He took a job with John Slaney, who sent him to Newfoundland in 1617. Then Squanto met explorer Thomas Dermer and traveled back to North America. Believe this or not, he actually made it all the way back to where he grew up in the year 1619, about a year before the Mayflower showed up. It was actually Massasoit who introduced Squanto to William Bradford and the Pilgrims. So Samoset and Massasoit and Squanto were the only 3 American Indians that were associated with the Pilgrims in a very friendly way. The survival of the Pilgrims greatly depended upon Squanto. In fact, it's highly probable if God didn't prepare Squanto through all the obstacles in life that he went through for such a time as that, there's a very good chance the Pilgrims never would have survived. He taught the Pilgrims how to make maple syrup, plant corn, how to use the body of dead fish to fertilize the land, and taught them which plants were edible to eat and which plants could produce medicines. Can you see God in all that in the life of Squanto? Sometime later, the Wampanoag tribe actually captured Squanto. Squanto was so important to the Pilgrims that they sent in Miles Standish to go in and rescue him. I'm surprised Hollywood never made a movie about Squanto. Squanto was loved and appreciated by all the Pilgrims. We can't prove it, but there's a very good possibility that he actually attended the first Thanksgiving that was held. In his journal, William Bradford said, Squanto was a, and I'm quoting, special instrument set by God for their good beyond their expectation, close quotes. Before Squanto died in November 1622 at what is now Chatham, Massachusetts, he gave all of his possessions to the Pilgrims and looked forward to going to the heaven that the Pilgrims all believed in. Today you will find Squanto on the Massachusetts flag. Now you know why his story is so important. William Bradford was, in my opinion, a type and shadow of Joshua. That is a good parallel to Israel. When Bradford died, the top of his gravestone was actually written in Hebrew. It's still there today up on Burial Hill in Plymouth. As we wind down this segment, I wanted you to know later John Endicott in 1628, 8 years after the Mayflower arrival, and with about 900 colonists settled in the area, what is now known as Salem, Massachusetts. You might remember Abraham meets Melchizedek in Salem. You'll find that in Genesis chapter 14 and 18 in the Bible. In 1630, John Winthrop would arrive, and he would be a new governor of the Pilgrims. And after Salem, the settlers would move and settle to an area that is now known as Charlestown. Years later, Cotton Mather, the famous Puritan minister, referred to Winthrop as America's Nehemiah. He said that because Nehemiah in the Bible led Israel back from captivity to the Promised Land, and the temple and the walls around Jerusalem were built up. Winthrop saw New England as a political and religious refuge. In fact, Winthrop referred to this area as a city on the hill, as we see in Matthew chapter 5, verse 14. Eventually, Winthrop viewed New England as a new vineyard of the Lord, and in a sense, a new Israel. Strangely enough, this same Charlestown was the same place the first battle of the American Revolution was fought in what is now the Bunker Hill area. Was this all by chance? Well, you be the judge. In our last segment about the Pilgrims and Puritans, is it possible the land called America was a type and shadow of the tabernacle in the wilderness? Up to now, we learn when Columbus arrived in the New World in the year 1492, he christened and named the first island that they came to as San Salvador, meaning Holy Savior. And when the English came to Jamestown, Virginia, as they got off their ships, they prayed and planted a cross in the sand and claimed this land for Jesus Christ. They had no idea this land was 3,000 miles wide, but actually it was. And when the Mayflower arrived at Plymouth Rock in the year 1620, we believe William Bradford was actually a type of Joshua, as in the Bible. Just as Joshua led the children of Israel into the land from the east with a mission from God, Bradford also entered the land, America, from the east, again with a mission statement from God. Most of you may not know this, but the Puritans and Pilgrims came to America with the purpose of their children living in freedom with the expectation of taking the gospel to the whole world. That was their mission statement, a very different mission statement than Jamestown, Virginia. If America is a type and shadow of the tabernacle in the wilderness, the geography of our land would show us a picture of that. So let's start with the arrival of Cape Cod. Did you ever notice that Cape Cod is actually in the shape of a coil? What would you say if I told you it actually is in the shape of a Hebrew letter, which is referred to as Tet? That's T-E-T. The letter Tet actually represents number 9. Every Hebrew letter represents a number. Unlike several other Hebrew letters, the letter Tet can represent something positive or something negative. On the negative side, it looks like a coiled snake, but its positive meaning is it represents a baby in its mother's womb, so it represents life. How did the ancient rabbis come up with that? Well, God told Abraham he was going to give him a biological son of promise. Abraham was 99 years old at that time, and Sarah was 90. Well, there's your number 9s. And when Isaac was born 9 months later, Abraham was 100 years old. The reason Cape Cod is in the shape of the Hebrew letter Tet is because it represents the birth of a nation. Not only would it be a refuge for Jews from all over the world, but a refuge of freedom for people from all over the world. Take some time and let that sink in, if you will. As you look at the tabernacle in the wilderness, when you enter in from the east, the first object you come in contact with is the brazen altar. Its fuel was from hot coals, and it was here sacrifices were made. As you look at the geography of America, as you come into the territory of Pennsylvania and thereabouts, this is where the coal and iron ore deposits of America are actually found. And our founding fathers from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania made many sacrifices in their lifetime, even for your freedoms. The second item in the tabernacle was the laver of water. This was where the priests cleansed themselves. Is there anything in America that's comparable to that? Well, yes, there is, and you call it the Great Lakes. So far, we've been outside in the outer court. Now, as we progress west, we enter the inner court of the tabernacle, which is actually indoors. It's the equivalent of being in the middle of America. As we enter the inner court, there's a table of showbread that's made up of wheat and grain. And as we look north from the middle of America, we see the breadbasket of America made up of wheat and grain. As we look south in the inner court, we see the menorah, or the candelabra. The primary ingredient, as you know, is oil. As we look south from the middle of America, we see the state of Texas. And that's where there are many oil refineries, and of course, the primary ingredient is in fact oil. As we continue west in the inner court, we come to the altar of incense. It's an altar made of golden plates with coal, which is coal for the fire, and there's spices placed on it. The idea is the sweet smell goes up from the prayers unto the Lord. There is actually a parallel with the state of Colorado. In ancient Israel, there were 11 types of spices used in this altar. Colorado not only had gold and coal in its past history, but many spices are actually grown and cultivated there today as well. As we continue west in the inner court, past the golden altar, we come right up against a huge veil. This veil separates the inner court from, as you know it, the Holy of Holies. In America, we have the Continental Divide, or the Rocky Mountains. This would parallel the veil. As we continue west past the veil, we enter the Holy of Holies. The Golden Room. This is where the Ark of the Covenant, of course, would be located. Is there anything comparable to that in our American geography? Well, yes, it's the state of California, which we call the Golden State. And yes, it's where Ronald Reagan is buried, and of course he was governor there at one time. Well, that's one for the Gipper, but on the serious side, do you think anything that I shared with you is by accident? Can you see the hand of God embedded in our history? As I wrap up this segment, just as God told Joshua to place 12 rocks on the Israeli side of the Jordan River to make a memorial about God's covenant with their people forever, is there a comparable memorial like that here in America? Well, actually there is. In fact, what I submit to you today is this memorial is the most important statue and memorial in all of America. It's called the National Monument to the Forefathers. It's the largest piece of granite in a monument anywhere in the country, and it's up on the hill in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Many of the original pilgrims are buried there up in these hills, including William Bradford. And at the end of the day, you will learn the meaning of this monument, what it's all about, and stay tuned for that. Well, folks, in this particular clip, we'll be discussing the National Monument to our Forefathers. And the National Monument to our Forefathers is an 81-foot tall monument commissioned by the Pilgrim Society. The monument is 180 tons of solid granite, the largest single piece of granite actually in the United States. The granite came originally from Hallowell, Maine, and it was completed in October 1888, and this monument was dedicated with ceremony on the 1st of August, 1889. On the main pedestal stands Faith, with her right hand pointing to heaven, and her left hand is holding the Bible, the Word of God. Upon the four buttresses are figures which represent the principles on which their colony was actually founded. As we look counterclockwise from the east, we see morality, law, education, and liberty. Under morality, we see the prophet and the evangelist. Under law, we see justice and mercy. And under education, we visualize youth and wisdom. And under the important liberty man, we see tyranny overcome and separately peace. Below the face of the main figures are reliefs made of marble showing scenes of the Pilgrim's history. Under morality, we see embarkation. Under the law, we see treaty. Under education, we see the compact, referring to the Mayflower Compact. And under liberty is the landing point at Plymouth, Massachusetts. This monument was paid for by the United States Congress and the state legislature of the state of Massachusetts. Built over a period of 70 years, it is expressed as a matrix of liberty, given to us by the Pilgrims and forefathers of our nation. They left this monument to you, America, that you would never forget the sacrifices that were made for your freedoms, and that you never, ever forget the concepts and principles under God that have been handed down to you and your children to study and live by. Because, you know, in one generation, all these things could be forgotten. And if they were forgotten, your republic would be possibly overthrown, and tyranny will once again rule the day. All the hopes and dreams and the concepts of faith and patriotism our forefathers left to you is all embedded in this monument. As we take the time to reveal the meaning of this stone structure, see if this makes sense to you. As we approach the monument, notice the woman that's representing faith is the tallest part of the structure. Observe her right hand is pointing to heaven, where God is. And in her left hand is an open Bible. And you can see the pages of the Bible are opened. Obviously, she has read it, and it's been used. The meaning is, if we have faith in God, we read and live by God's Word, the Bible, all these other principles grafted into the statue can actually come together. If we neglect God and His statute, we can never enjoy true freedom. Because Lady Faith read and lived by God's Word, she has a star on her head which represents wisdom. All the other 20-ton statues surrounding this monument are tied into the concept of faith in God. As we go counterclockwise now, the next statue we see down is below is morality. Morality represents internal liberty. Notice Lady Morality has no eyes. That was actually intentional because she's working on an internal character. So when your heart is right with God and your neighbor, that brings about an external transformation of righteousness. Notice she has 10 commandments in her left hand and a scroll of revelation in her right hand. That's because morality has to have a standard to live by. And it's not our way, but God's way. Beneath Lady Morality on her left and right, we see the evangelist. The evangelist preaches the gospel message, and as people hear that, Lady Morality is transforming their heart. On the other side of Lady Morality is a picture of the prophet. It represents Moses in the Ten Commandments in her left hand. And as we continue around the monument, we come to the statue of law. If we want to build on morality, there has to be a civil system of law in the land that we can operate in a safe environment. Over time, that became federal, state, and local law. So God's law has civil law underneath it. God gave civil government authority over us too. And of course, we see that in Romans chapter 13. If you look into the piercing eyes of law, you can see he is clearly focused. In his left hand, he has a book of civil law, and in his right hand, we see mercy. As there are consequences for disobeying law, there also must be a provision under certain cases that there can be mercy. Down below law, we see a lady with the scales of justice and equity. Notice it's balanced, meaning equal law for everyone, and it applies to the rich and powerful as well as to the poor. On the other side of law is mercy. Many tyrannical governments throughout the world torture and in some cases have killed those in opposition to their sovereignty. Case in point, 70 years of communism in Russia while millions of their own people died in gulags with no possibility of mercy. And millions under Mao Zedong in China were murdered or starved to death. No mercy there either. There could be a lesson there for people that are calling for a socialistic government in America. As we continue around to the next statue, we see the lady that represents education. Notice she is opening up a book. That book represents the Bible. Pay particular attention. There's something on her head. It's a crown, and that crown represents victory. She is also sitting on a seat of victory. The meaning behind this statue is she is sitting in victory because she brought up her children in the Lord. It was believed the mother had the primary role of bringing up the children in the Lord, and that was at the forefront of American education at first, believe it or not. And this may come as a complete surprise, but the First Continental Congress actually funded and purchased the first English Bibles by the thousands to be disseminated to schools throughout the land. And that happened here in America in the year 1647. So when you heard for years the early government wanted a separation of church and state, all of that was actually untrue. The early Congress wanted Bibles in the schools and homes, and they made the funds for that to see to it that that would in fact happen. As a matter of historical fact, our founding fathers were not agnostics, nor were they deists. Did you know of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 29 of them held seminary degrees? When's the last time you heard about that in school? Well, as we continue, now below Lady Education on her left is youth, and a picture of a woman with a book in her left hand, and in her right hand is her child with a scroll in his little hand. You see, it was the parents' responsibility at first at home to educate the children, not the schools. The schools were supposed to reinforce those Christian values. A far cry from today. Keep in mind the Pilgrims, when living back in England, that government had a very different world secular view on how the children would be educated. Down below Lady Education on her right is the caption, Wisdom. It shows an old man with gray hair who represents the wisdom of the grandparents. Below the old man's left foot are the 10 Commandments and a Bible. Near his right foot is a globe of the world. Now, the meaning of this picture in stone is the old man reinforces the idea of God's word into the young. And the globe of the earth there is painting a picture of children receiving wisdom from God's word, which ultimately they would take that to the four corners of the earth. And the elderly, of course, were in favor of all of that. As we continue counterclockwise, we come to the last statue, and his name is Liberty. We will call him Liberty Man. To start with, he is sitting on a liberty chair. He looks strong and formidable. Liberty Man is an ultimate result of all the metrics we've learned up to now on this particular monument. There's a lot of detail displayed on this Liberty Man statue. Notice the broken chain on his left knee. He has a happy facial expression because through his fighting spirit, the chain of tyranny has been broken. The chain represents the tyrannies the pilgrims left behind in England. If you look over Liberty Man's right shoulder, there is a claw. It's a lion's claw. Notice a lion's skin was wrapped around Liberty Man, and below his right side, you see the head of a lion that's dead. The tyranny they left behind in England has been slain through the efforts of liberty. Down below Liberty Man's right side, we see the caption, Tyranny. There's a picture of Liberty Man praising God with one hand and his foot on the chest of a man lying down. The meaning is Liberty Man had victory over tyranny in England. It's important to know the pilgrims attained this victory through the peaceful means they learned from the principles of God's law. You might notice a sword is draped over his right arm. The meaning of the sword is Liberty Man is defending his family and their values. This is an important question we must all ask ourselves. Are we defending our family and values in a peaceful way? Aside from arming ourselves with our Christian values, we also can do our part by being good citizens and patriots by voting for men and women who share the same values that we do. He doesn't want to fight, but if it's necessary, he has that capability, just as you have your Second Amendment rights. Now, down below Liberty Man's left side, we see the caption, Peace. That is the ultimate result if we come and live by and abide by all the concepts encapsulated in this statute system. Just as God told Joshua to leave 12 rocks as a memorial to their children to remember God's covenant to his people about their promised land, our forefathers have left this important monument to us to study and to learn if we want to know our true destiny, not only as an individual, but also as a great nation. In this particular segment, I'd like to share with you a little bit about the history of the first American flag. Now, most of us have been taught the American flag was designed by Betsy Ross. By the way, there's no doubt she sewed many American flags. However, but there is also a historian, there are a number of historians that actually believe that there was someone else who actually designed the first flag. And his name was Francis Hopkinson. You might be interested to know, number one, he was a Jewish man. He was also a delegate to the Continental Congress from the state of New Jersey, and he also signed the Declaration of Independence. He also designed several designing seals for various departments within the United States government. He strongly felt he deserved payment for designing the flag, but was denied on the grounds that he was an employee of the government. Now, there were others who helped design the flag, later designs of the flag after him, but we feel very strongly that Francis Hopkinson played a major part in designing actually the first American flag. We encourage you to do your own research on Francis Hopkinson. If you dig down deep enough, I think you'll find there's very strong evidence about that. It'd be a very sad story if all of this is true and his story got buried because of his faith. Could it possibly be that this is another parallel to Israel with a Jewish man helping in designing the first American flag? Well, folks, in this segment, we'll be talking about a parallel in Israel's history between Moses, a long time ago, and Dr. Martin Luther King in our modern history. I want to go back to the time of Moses, about 3,500 years ago. You may remember that Moses was born and raised, obviously, in Egypt. And when he was growing up, of course, growing up as a part of the Pharaoh's court, if you will, he's very well educated. Most of you probably don't know this, but the area he grew up in and resided in, we believe, was a place called Memphis, Egypt. Okay, and of course, there's a very long river there, the longest river in the world, the Nile River, 4,162 miles long. As you know, later in life, it will take 40 years to go to the Promised Land, and that story you're very familiar with. So how long did it take to get to the Promised Land? Well, obviously it was 40 years. And of course, Moses was not allowed to go in the Promised Land. However, he was allowed to look into the Promised Land before the Jews went into the land. So he did look into the Promised Land. And now, what's the parallel between that and Dr. Martin Luther King? Well, I want to go back to Dr. King when he was born. It's the 15th of January, 1929. However, if you go back 9 months in his mother's womb, obviously that's 9 more months. He died on April 4th, 1968. You notice, if you go in the history books, it says he was 39 years old, but if you count the time in his mother's womb, it's 40. And 40 is a time of testing. And there is a parallel, several parallels actually, with Moses. So let's talk about that a little bit. So now I want to say the latter years of Dr. King's life was spent, he put his life on the line numerous times. He really believed in the cause, and he ended up dying for what he believed in. He was actually assassinated on the 4th of April, 1968. So let's talk about it. Where was Dr. King located when he died? Well, he was in a city, and that city was called Memphis, Tennessee. And there's a river there. It's the longest river in the United States of America. You can probably see the parallel with the Nile and Moses here for a moment. But I want to go back to the night before he died, which was the night of April 3rd, 1968. He was at a Baptist church. There was a large thunderstorm going on. You could hear flashes of lightning. He was very emotional in his preaching. The sweat was coming out of his face. And he told the people, I've been to the mountaintop, and I've looked into the Promised Land, but I might not make it in there with you. I want you to think about that for a moment. That's exactly what happened to Moses. And going back to Moses briefly, if you ever wanted to get to Moses, he had a right-hand man, and his name was Aaron. Well, Dr. King had a right-hand man, if you will, and his name was Reverend Ralph Abernathy. He was a very godly man, I might say. So you can see the parallel with Israel's history, I believe. But you have to give credit to Dr. King. A lot of lives were changed for the better because of what he did. And I can tell you that personally. I remember life in America before 1968. There's a lot of turmoil going on, all the way back to the time of Lincoln, if you will, as well. And there were huge changes, 1964 to 1968, and after that, because of the works of Dr. King. So I'd like to say that I believe that God used him in a very mighty way. I know he puts his pants on like everybody else, but truly he was a great man. We have to give him credit for that, and he gave his life for what we believed in. Now, I want to go back just briefly to Abraham Lincoln, because there's another parallel with Dr. King. We all remember the I Have a Dream speech. That was made August 28th, 1963. I want to go back exactly 100 years to the year to 1863. I want to go back to April 30th, 1863. It was the year that Abraham Lincoln proclaimed something very special. It was called the Day of Humility and Fasting and Prayer. He asked the whole nation back then in 1863 to pray for forgiveness of sin, and it was a time of fasting as well. In other words, repentance. Abraham Lincoln wanted the nation to repent. He's the only president in United States history that asked America to repent. And of course, it was about slavery, and he said that this was about slavery as well, the sin of slavery. So I think there were huge things that happened with Dr. Martin Luther King and the impact that he had on America in a huge social way. So I just wanted to give great credit to him. I think you can see some kind of a parallel between Israel's history and America's history, just as we talked about a parallel with William Bradford in Joshua earlier in our film. And if you like this, you get something out of it, share it with your friends. Well, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Michael Smith. I'll be your host today. We're coming to you from Mount Rushmore, as a matter of fact. We've got a very interesting show for you that I think you're going to learn a lot of things that you never heard before. I had a chance to be in Dallas, Texas in September 2019 at a prophecy conference put on by Southwest Radio. And while there, I watched this gentleman dressed up in Revolutionary War clothes give a presentation. He talked about how pastors during the Revolutionary War played a very major part for the success of that war. I was really taken back by that. I thought it was pretty important. So I've had an opportunity to make contact with Pastor Dan Fisher. So I'd like to introduce today Pastor Dan Fisher from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Good having you aboard.
Oh, it's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, you're quite welcome. I'm very honored that you could be here today. So I'd like to ask Pastor Dan if he could maybe give us a little bit of your background.
Oh, sure. I grew up in western Arkansas, started preaching when I was 16. I was full-time in the ministry by the time I was 22. By the time I was 24, I was a senior pastor. I've been pastoring all these years. I'll turn 61 next week, so you can do the math. I've been at it for a long time. And over the course of that time, I've come to understand the role that the church and pastors in particular played in our War of Independence. And so a number of years ago, I started talking to folks and telling them the story that most of us have never heard about how the church led out. We're the tip of the spear, so to speak. And just one thing led to the next. A ministry came out of it, and so now in period costume like I have on here, I go to folks and tell them the story of how the pastors and the churches were the key ingredient to birthing our republic that we know today. And I'm still serving as a pastor in Edmond, Oklahoma with a fellow patriot pastor named Paul Blair. And I'm just, I'm honored to be here with you and to retell this story that I think is so critical, especially in the times in which we're living right now.
Yes. I'm going to be asking some questions, and I'm going to use the term the framers. Don't mean to put you on the spot,
Sure.
But just tell the folks when we use the term the framers what we'll be talking about.
Yeah, well, when I speak of framers, what I'm talking about is the generation that wrote documents like the Declaration of Independence, fought for our independence, penned the Constitution, as opposed to the founders, which would be the people like the Pilgrims who came in 1620. So the framers would be that group around our birthing as a republic in the 1770s.
Okay, very good. Well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and proceed and ask a few questions. We have been told that rather than embracing traditional Christian values, the framers were deists.
Yeah.
Is this, in fact, correct?
Well, it's not true, and yet there are many people who are under that false illusion. I think it's important to just quickly define what a deist is. A deist is a person who believes that God made the universe and then basically went away and left it running on its own, kind of like a watchmaker who makes a watch and then leaves the watch shop and never returns. Well, when you read the writings of the founders and the framers, it is obvious that they were anything but that. They believed in what they often call providence, but then they would often say providence of the Almighty. So they obviously believe that God is involved in everything that's going on, the exact opposite of a deist. So no, they weren't. There were probably some deists, but the overwhelming majority of them believed in an active God who was interacting with them.
Okay. Were many of the framers Christians in the biblical sense that we think today?
You know, I believe they were. If you go through and you look at men that signed the Declaration of Independence, people like Benjamin Rush, Roger Sherman, Charles Carroll. I mean, you just go through a long list. Men who signed the Constitution. You will find that these men were proclaimed Christians. I mean, they said Jesus Christ is their Lord and Savior. But then you have another group of the founders and then framers that we're talking about today, who, even if they weren't born-again Christians in the biblical sense, had a profound respect for the God of the Bible and believed that morality was the only way that you can have self-governance. And to illustrate how they believed that God was involved in their lives and in what was going on, think about George Washington when he was 23 in the French and Indian War.
Yes.
Here, he's leading the American contingency along with the British, commanded by William Braddock, toward what is modern-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They're ambushed by the French and the Indians, and in the process, the British and American soldiers are being slaughtered. In fact, General Bradford is mortally wounded and dies not long afterwards. Washington takes control, and even though this is some of his early experiences on the battlefield, organizes an orderly retreat and kept that entire military group from being slaughtered. And yet, when the battle is over, the word is out that he had been killed. So that happened, the battle happened on July the 9th, 1755. Well, on July the 18th, he penned a letter to his brother John. And he said, John, I just want to encourage you. I'm not dead. I'm still among the living. But by the grace of providence, I was saved, even though there were 4 bullet holes in my coat and 2 horses shot out from under me. So it's obvious that Washington believed that God was involved. Yes. If you think about the Continental Congress, when they first met, you know what their first act was? On September the 7th, 1774, in Carpenter's Hall, they called a local preacher by the name of Jacob Duché, and they had a prayer meeting. In fact, there's a very famous painting of the first prayer in Congress. Now, are those the actions of men who were unbelievers or believed that God wasn't involved? Of course not. So, though not all of our framers were born-again Christians in the biblical sense, although some of them definitely were, guys like Patrick Henry and others, they all had a profound respect for God and wanted his interaction and intervention in what they were doing.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, how much influence did Christian principles influence the framers and their particular thinking?
Oh, my goodness. I think the greatest illustration of how biblical principle influenced the framers is to just read some of the phrases in our Declaration of Independence, which is our birth certificate. Things like the consent of the governed, that our rights are from God, not from government.
Right.
The idea that it is the people who are in charge of government, not the other way around, that governments are organized to protect these rights. These are all ideas that come out of Christian thought, not out of pagan thought. Right. You take, for instance, John Adams. John Adams, our first vice president, second president, he says about the Constitution that it was written wholly for a moral and religious people.
Yes.
It is completely inadequate for the government of any other. Well, who would say that except someone who's, at the very least, heavily influenced by Christian thought? George Washington says that the 2 supports that hold up free governance are morality and religion, and you can't have morality if you don't have religion. And of course, he would have been primarily referring to Christianity. So the Christian principles had a major impact in what our framers believed, and then of course what they did, and then our founding documents that have protected liberty for so many decades.
Did the Christian church play a significant role
technically in the founding of America?
Oh, I don't think there's any way to overestimate the role the church played. If you go all the way back to the Pilgrims with the founders, I mean, they wrote in their Mayflower Compact that they were basically missionaries. They said, we have come to further the gospel of Jesus Christ. So, you know, you go all the way back. But if you talk about the period of our War of Independence, the church was the hub. Now, this might seem funny to some of our folks watching this, but the church was the hub of culture. Everything revolved around the church.
Yes.
The church was doing its job in the 18th century. The pastor typically was the most educated guy in town. People would go to him for their news, for information, and the church was so vital that they pierced the darkness of that culture and of that time. So it would just make sense that because they were so influential, they would play this major role. In fact, even though we haven't talked about the Black Regiment yet, the preachers who were engaged, and many of them were, the Army recruiters, when they would come to town to recruit soldiers for the Continental Army, instead of trying to recruit themselves, they'd go find a local preacher, because he could do a lot better job of recruiting than the recruiter could. It just shows you the influence of the church. So when you read the writings of the framers, it's impossible to miss this heavy influence. In the mid-19th century, there were people who were arguing that the government was becoming too influenced by Christianity, and that the framers never intended to be Christian friendly and protect the church. And so the judiciary committees of both the House and the Senate, and we're talking about Congress, both did independent studies, and they concluded that there is no question that those who birthed America intended for it to have Christian overtones in our philosophy, and that they would literally have ended their efforts if they thought it was otherwise. So anyone who does any serious study of our history would know that the church played a critical role. Was everybody a Christian? No, of course not. But it was a very dominant force in the 18th century.
Now this next question, you touched on it just briefly, but you used the term Black Robe Regiment. So who really was the, quote, Black Robe Regiment, technically?
Wow. That's a piece of our history that we've missed. Most folks watching it may not have ever even heard of what was initially called the Black Regiment. What it was a term or a phrase to refer to the black robes that preachers wore in those days. In those days, it didn't matter if you were Baptist or Lutheran or Presbyterian. It didn't matter if Congregationalist. All preachers preached in black robes. But many of these pastors were engaged in their communities. They weren't just pastors. If you compare it to the way it is in our day, in the 21st century, so many pastors just stay kind of cloistered away in their church and they don't interact. Many pastors were involved in government. They would write political essays and were asked about political issues. Many of the pastors, for instance, Peter Muhlenberg, who's kind of the quintessential Black Robe Regiment preacher, was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, served with George Washington and Patrick Henry. So the Black Regiment was actually the preachers, and they began to recruit the men from their churches and their communities when the war was on, and actually led them off into the battlefield to fight. And the Tories in America, they were the Americans who sided with the British, and the British hated these preachers. And if they captured them on the battlefield, sometimes they would actually execute them right on the field. Or they'd throw them on a prison ship, which was a terrible experience. And so Peter Oliver, who was from Massachusetts, a Tory, was the one who came up with Black Regiment. Now, we often today say Black Robed Regiment, so people will know what we're referring to. It's the robes, but these were the preachers.
Not the Supreme Court.
Not the Supreme Court, right. No. And I also want to clarify that there was not a regiment of preachers. It was preachers who were recruiting men from their churches and their communities, and they would lead normally militia groups out onto the battlefield. You know, I mentioned Peter Muhlenberg. He actually became regular military, was on General George Washington's staff, and by the time the war was over, was promoted to Major General Peter Muhlenberg. He was a Lutheran, And his statue is in Statuary Hall, the Capitol building today in D.C. He's in the painting of the surrender of Cornwallis. So these guys, I believe, were the ones who made the difference. I don't think we would have had a war, Brother Mike, without these preachers and the involvement of the Black Robed Regiment. And if folks have never read much about the Black Regiment or the Black Robed Regiment, they need to do some research, because it is an amazing story that most of us have just simply missed.
Okay, very good. Now, did our framers seek to found a democracy?
Goodness, no. In fact, that's the thing they didn't want. You know, democracy, you hear this all the time in the 21st century, our democracy, our democracy. Right. We don't have a democracy. We have a republic. We have a representative republic that operates by the rule of law and uses the democratic process in that the people are involved in the process. But a democracy can be one of the most cruel kinds of government there is, where just a very slim majority can steamroll a large minority. You just have to have barely over 50%. You can just steamroll everybody else. So the framers intentionally created a republic where we would have representative government, where you won't have the rule of the mob, so to speak.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So just define what we mean by republic so the folks know.
Yeah. Well, a republic is where the power is vested in the people. As the Declaration says, we are given by our Creator certain unalienable rights. And then the people create governments to protect those rights. So a republic is where the people rule by the rule of law. So we create laws. We've got the U.S. Constitution. We have the Declaration of Independence. And in that scenario, the government is of, by, and for the people. That's why the Constitution begins with these words, we the people, not we the government. So that's what a republic is.
That's good.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this question. Did the framers and their particular generation, did they believe in, now we've heard a lot of this, did they believe in the separation of church and state?
Oh, goodness, no. It's not difficult to prove that they didn't. For instance, during Jefferson's administration, there were church services throughout the Capitol area. And I'm talking about the building. Here's the thing. If you read the framers, they understood that self-governance is only possible in a moral culture. Adams goes at length to talk about that. I mentioned a while ago that he says our Constitution is wholly inadequate for a government outside of a moral and religious people. So when you look at how they were involved, this concept of separation of church and state is ridiculous, number one. Number two, they had just fought a war to separate themselves from the Church of England and the control of the king. Why in the world would they then want to just shove the church off into the corner when they understood that without a moral culture, you're not going to have self-governance? No, they did not believe in the separation of church and state. Now, they were very careful that they didn't want a theocracy. And this is where I think most people misunderstand the terms. A theocracy is where the church is the government. Well, they didn't want that. So this is why in the Bill of Rights, the very first amendment to the U.S. Constitution says that Congress shall make no law establishing religion. Because they didn't want a theocracy. Right. Well, I don't either. I bet you don't either. So it's not that the framers wanted such a mixture of church and state that you'd have a theocratic government. But this concept of religious expression not being welcome, like for instance, on the courthouse lawn, you can't erect a nativity scene. Do we honestly believe that's what the framers were fighting to prevent? Or you can't have a prayer in a school, or you can't have a prayer before a football game, or you can't display the Ten Commandments. These things are utterly ridiculous if you travel back to the time of the framers and what they were fighting for.
So where did that concept, do you think, came from?
Yeah. Well,
separation of church and state.
Yeah, well it's been used by the left, by the political left, to get rid of religious expression. But where it actually comes from is in a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1802 to the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut. They had heard a rumor that Jefferson and the federal government, he was president then, were going to establish a national church, a national denomination. Well, obviously, these Baptists are very concerned because they don't want that. They don't want a theocracy. So they write President Jefferson and they say, is this true? Are you guys going to do this? And Jefferson said, not only are we not going to do it, we're prevented from doing that by our own Constitution. And then this is where he uses the phrase. He says there is a wall of separation that's erected by the Constitution to keep us from doing that. Now then, in our day, what we've done is we've taken Jefferson's statement, we've turned it upside down, and rather than the wall protecting the church from government, which is what Jefferson meant, yes, we've flipped it to say the wall is to protect the government from the church. It's the exact opposite of what Jefferson was saying in his letter in 1802. So that's actually where the phrase comes from. It was co-opted in the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s, and unfortunately today has become the rule, and people think that Thomas Jefferson and everybody else wanted religious expression to be very, very private, not public, and very restricted. And it's just not, it's not so.
Well, how has the myth of separation affected our culture and our republic today?
Yeah. So ultimately, the goal of the left, and you can read it in Karl Marx's writings and others, is to just do away with religious belief or expression, because that's kind of the opiate of the people, he said. So what has happened is, since the left has been able to co-opt this separation of church and state concept, they've sold it to an uneducated populace in America, and with every given decade, we're less and less educated about our true history. Mm-hmm. And they've sold it to the public to the point that they believe religion ought to be kept separate. And so what it's done is it's secularized our culture, and you look today at the violence and the godlessness. I believe it's all a direct result of a false belief pushed by the left to get rid of God and the accountability to God. Mm-hmm. And so because of it, we're paying a heavy, heavy, heavy price.
Okay. Well, why is a significant portion of our culture moving to the left philosophically and politically today?
Yeah. Well, I believe that's because the church has given in to the same thing. You'll hear the phrase separation of church and state as often in churches you'll hear it anywhere. And the reason why is because Christians, especially pastors, are under the false illusion of separation. And so what they do then is they refuse to get engaged. They won't speak out about political issues. They won't help their people to understand who they ought to vote for, who stands for what. It's completely foreign to the pulpit. Now that's the exact opposite. In fact, a historian writing in 1860, John Wingate Thornton, said that the fathers of the Republic did not divorce politics and religion, and they denounced the separation as ungodly. Now today, where are we? We're the exact opposite. So what it has done, it has silenced the church. Pastors today are censoring their own comments and beliefs. Now, unfortunately, in 2020, we're living in a day where many pastors, I'm not sure, even have solid beliefs. The church has become so compromised. So the end result is you've got a weak, anemic church. You have a pulpit that won't preach the whole truth of God. We censor things and just tell people what they want to hear. And in the end, we're not only losing the culture, which is bad enough. We're not only losing our republic, which will be devastating. We're losing men and women's souls. Because in the end, this is all about eternity. You remember Jesus said, what is a man profited if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? Yes. And that's what's happening. And so the end result is we're losing everything.
Mm-hmm. Well, Pastor, my last question today is, so what should modern Christians do to push back on the leftward slide of our union today?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. That's probably the million-dollar question today, because we're approaching a time where you can have candidates unashamedly say, I'm a socialist, which is just a nice way of saying communist. It's unbelievable that somebody like a Bernie Sanders can gain such a following. I grew up in a time where the Socialist Party would run a candidate, everybody would laugh because they knew that they wouldn't get hardly any votes. Today, my gosh. So what can we do? Well, first of all, we can recognize the mess we're in. I mean, we just have to admit it. We're in a mess here. Americans, especially Christians, are going to have to go back and take a look at our history. You would have not had the Black Robe Regiment if they believed what we're being told today. Separation of church and state, don't get involved, don't be political, don't say anything. Well, we wouldn't even have a republic. It would have never been birthed. So Christians need to get educated. We need to learn history. We haven't been taught our history. Let me give you one example of how we don't know our history. On April the 18th, 1775, a man by the name of Paul Revere is making a famous ride. Now, he's not the only one actually riding, but he's riding, and he's yelling, the regulars are out, the regulars are coming. Well, what most people don't know is when he rides into Lexington, Massachusetts, he rides up to the pastor's house, Jonas Clark, because Pastor Jonas Clark, with the help of a deacon named John Parker, had been training the men of their church and the community how to fight together as soldiers. They were calling themselves Minutemen. It was going on all over New England. Now, who forgot to tell me that the famous Lexington Minutemen were trained and led by a preacher and a deacon? That night, Pastor Clark had Samuel Adams and John Hancock in his home. In fact, John Hancock's grandfather had pastored that very church years before. If you go to Lexington today, there is a granite pulpit monument right where Jonas Clark's church stood, right there where the Battle of Lexington occurred. And John Hancock's grandfather's name is etched on it in the list of all the pastors that pastored that church. So Revere rides to Pastor Clark's house and wants to know if the men will stand. So that very next day, April the 19th, 1775, Battle of Lexington, later on that afternoon, the Battle of Concord, is fought in what we'd call the churchyard of Jonas Clark's church. It was the meeting house in Lexington, having heard from Paul Revere the night before. And here are many of these men in the Lexington Minutemen who are actually members of Jonas Clark's church. Now, we haven't been told that. All we've heard about is Paul Revere yelling, the British are coming. Well, he wouldn't have been saying the British was coming. He was an Englishman. He would have said the regulars are coming. But we don't know the rest of the story.
Yeah.
This is what has happened. So Americans have got to reacquaint themselves with our history. Secondly, they've got to get engaged. We cannot keep apologizing for believing in our republic. Make America great again is not just a phrase that Donald Trump ought to be saying. Certainly Christian American should want to make America great. And the only way that America can be great is like Alex de Tocqueville, the Frenchman who came to America, wanted to find out what was so special about us. And remember, he said, it was only when I went to the pulpits and heard those messages of fire that I realized America is great because America is good. But if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. So Christians have got to re-engage, get involved, start voting. Did you know that 50% of American Christians don't vote?
Oh, that's terrible.
50%. Well, that's the least we can do, but certainly we could vote. We've got to get engaged. And then I think the third thing that we've got to do is we've got to awaken the church. Christians especially have got to demand that their pastors preach the whole counsel of God and not just little slivers of the Bible that everybody wants to hear, Christian psychology. They've got to demand it. And if their pastors won't do it, they've got to change their pastors. And if their pastor won't engage, they can't get rid of the pastor, then those people need to pull up their roots, pull up stakes, and go to a church where a pastor will deal with these subjects and strengthen this cause. Because just as the church presided over what I call the sunrise of liberty in North America in 1776, the American church today, if we don't straighten up our act, we're going to preside over the sunset of liberty in North America. And I think it's that critical. And that's why what you're doing is so important, because
Thank you.
Americans need to know their history and especially Christians. Of all people, we've been set free by the blood of Christ. Well, we ought to be the greatest liberty lovers there are. We ought to be leading the pack. We ought to be the tip of the spear.
Amen.
We're not. So that's what we have to do, and I'm convinced if we don't do that, we're going to lose our republic. The gospel is going to be driven underground.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. You know, I wanted the folks to know when we met back in September 2019 at a prophecy conference, I had an opportunity to purchase your book, Bringing Back the Black Robe Regiment. It's over 400 pages in here, and I wanted the folks to know this is very important information. There's really nothing like this anywhere else in America, a book like this. It's very specific about the history that the pastors played in actually securing our independence. And so that, plus along with the fact that there is a DVD, I had an opportunity to purchase your DVD as well. It's called Bringing Back the Black Robe Regiment. And so tell the folks how they can acquire the book and the DVD.
Well, thank you. Thank you for promoting those. You know, this book has over 600 footnotes. There's over 100 sources in the bibliography. This is not a book filled with anecdotes. All that's in this is documented fact. There's some stories we left out because we couldn't find enough documentation. So when the folks read this, they're going to be reading documented history. And the way the folks can get it is just go to our website, Dan Fisher, and then the 3 letters BRR, stands for BlackRobeRegiment.com. So Dan Fisher, BRR.com, and they can order the book, the DVD, and I'm releasing other materials as time goes by, and they can check us out and see what we're doing in trying to bring back the Black Robe Regiment.
Outstanding. Well, folks, you heard a lot of good things today, and I encourage you to not only pray for our leadership in America, but this is information that you can pass down to your children and grandchildren, and that's part of being a patriot. Well, Pastor, before you go today, I just have one last question. Doesn't necessarily have to apply to the American Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
But what is your greatest American story? Could you share that with us?
Oh, goodness. It's when Thomas Allen from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, who was the chaplain and the commander of the Berkshire Militia, he went to the Battle of Bennington, Vermont. And when he got his men positioned, he was wearing his preaching robe. And he walked out into the killing ground between the two armies, and he jumped up on a fallen tree, and he gave the British the opportunity to surrender. And some of the men that were there, the Tories, recognized him, and they said, well, there's old Preacher Allen, somebody ought to pop him. And they fired a volley of musket fire, and musket balls are hitting all around him. One even put a hole in his hat, but they missed him. Yeah. He goes back to his brother, Joseph, and he stands beside Joe, and he said, Joe, you know I'm a better shot than you. You load and I'll shoot. And he and his brother fight all day long at that battle. After the battle, he helps to care for the wounded. At the end of the week, he rides back to his church to preach. When he gets there, an irate church member says, Preacher, I need to have some words with you. So Pastor Allen says, well, okay. And he says, well, I heard the other day you fought like a common soldier. And Thomas Allen said, well, yes, every man had to do his duty. He said, but you're a preacher. Surely you didn't kill anybody. And Thomas Allen said, well, I don't know if I killed anybody, but I did notice behind a particular bush that there was a frequent flash, and every time that flash occurred, one of our men would fall. So I took steady aim and I fired at that bush. I don't know if I killed anybody, but I put out that flash. And that's Pastor Thomas Allen. I mean, just moments like that.
So I appreciate you sharing that story about Pastor Allen. For the folks that I'm just going to share this with you. I was actually born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts.
Isn't that amazing?
Just within 2 miles of where Thomas Allen is buried. In fact, I was at his grave. As you know, I was at his grave last October 2019, and he died in 1810. But what a story for America. Well, America, I hope you're blessed, and may God bless America. Thank you for being with us,
Oh, thank
Pastor.
you, Brother Mike. Thank you. God bless you. God bless you.
Well, folks, I hope that you liked our film today. I just wanted to say, before we leave you, when you go back to Israel's history, when they left Egypt to go to the Promised Land, you know it was the 400th year. So victory came in the 400th year. as you go back to that time frame, the year that they left Egypt, the 400th year, there was a quarantine going on. They were quarantined overnight, and there was a plague going overhead, as you know. And there was an expectation, and the expectation was that they ultimately would be going to the Promised Land. Of course, it would take 40 years to get there. Well, what's that got to do with us? Well, actually, it has a lot to do with us, because this is the 400th year from Plymouth Rock, 1620 to 2020. And there's also a plague going overhead. There's people who are being quarantined. Did you know there were people in Israel this year? This is the first time in 3,500 years people in Israel, Jewish people, were under quarantine with COVID-19. And people were all over the world, actually, including America. So this is the 400th year. There's a plague going overhead. But this time there's an expectation. And this expectation is the rapture. Well, folks, I hope that you enjoyed our film. We talked about a lot of things, many of which you've never heard before. If you like what you've heard, please share it with your rabbi or your pastor. This would be an outstanding DVD to show in your church or Sunday school. We want the word to get out about America's history, what really happened back then. And you know, the Lord had a hand in all of this. And hopefully we showed God's hand in all the history that we presented to you in this film. Well, folks, may the Lord bless you in a mighty way. May God bless you, and may God bless America.